Hey there! In our previous sessions, we've explored how markets function from individual consumer choices to the behavior of firms in different market structures. But in this session, we're going to shift our focus slightly. We're going to examine situations where markets don't always produce the most desirable outcomes for the society as a whole. We're going to talk about market failures. And that's where the government often steps in to try and correct those market failures and improve overall societal well-being. Okay, so in this session, we'll be exploring two key concepts: public goods and externalities. Okay, we'll see how these phenomena can lead to market failures, and then we'll analyze the various ways the government can intervene to address them. All right, let's take a look at the roadmap for this session. First, we'll start by distinguishing between public goods and private goods. This is fundamental because public goods have unique characteristics that often lead to market failures. Then, we'll delve into the world of externalities. We'll examine both spillover benefits or positive externalities and spillover costs or negative externalities. Okay? We'll see how these externalities, whether in consumption or production, can create inefficiencies. We'll also discuss how subsidies can be used to encourage activities with spillover benefits and how taxes can be used to discourage activities with spillover costs. Finally, we'll touch upon income distribution and tax structures. Okay? While not directly related to market failure in the same way as public goods and externalities, the government's role in influencing income distribution is another important area where it intervenes in the economy. Alright, so we're moving on to a new topic, public goods and externalities, and we'll start by comparing them to private goods. This table highlights the key differences between these two types of goods. Let's start with the first line, which we'll call access. Okay? Private goods are excludable. What does that mean? It means that access is restricted to those who pay. Think of a slice of pizza. If you don't pay for it, the pizza shop won't give it to you. Public goods, on the other hand, are non-excludable. It means that people cannot be prevented from using them. Think of national defense. Everyone in the country benefits from it, whether they pay taxes or not. Okay? Next, we have rivalry. Private goods are rivalrous. This means that if one person consumes the good, the amount available for others is reduced. If you eat that slice of pizza, no one else can eat it. Public goods are non-rivalrous. One person's consumption does not reduce the amount available for others. Some examples of your private goods are your everyday items, right? Food, clothing, cars, houses, things you buy and use as individuals. Public goods are often provided by the government, like national defense, street lighting, public parks, etc. When it comes to market failure, private markets are usually efficient at providing private goods because of clear ownership and pricing. But public markets often underprovide public goods. This is because of the free rider problem. Since people can benefit from public goods without paying, they have an incentive to be free riders, enjoying the benefits without contributing. Alright, so we've talked about how markets can be efficient, but what happens when they are not? Market failure occurs when the free market fails to allocate resources efficiently, meaning that it doesn't maximize overall social welfare. In other words, the market outcome is not the best outcome for the society as a whole. And one of the main reasons for market failure is the existence of externalities. An externality is a cost or benefit that affects a party who did not choose to incur that cost or benefit. It's a spillover effect. It's like when someone's actions have consequences for others that aren't reflected in the market price. In an ideal market, we achieve efficiency when the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost. The MSB represents the total benefit to the society from consuming one more unit of a good or service. This includes both the private benefit to the consumer and any external benefits to others. The MSC represents the total cost to the society of producing one more unit of a good or service. This includes both the private cost to the producer and any external costs imposed on others. Okay? In this graph, the efficient level of output is Q2, where MSB equals MSC, and the efficient price is P2. However, sometimes markets don't naturally arrive at this efficient outcome. If there are externalities, either positive or negative, the market equilibrium, where the private supply and demand intersect, will not be the same as the social optimum, where MSB equals MSC. Okay, we'll explore positive and negative externalities in more detail in the following slides. Alright, let's start with positive externalities in consumption. These occur when the consumption of a good or service generates benefits for third parties, for people other than the buyer. Think about vaccinations. When you get vaccinated, you're protecting yourself, which is the private benefit. But you're also making it less likely that you'll spread the disease to others, which is the external benefit. Or consider education. When you get an education, you benefit from increased knowledge and earning potential, right? But society also benefits from having more informed and productive citizens. In this graph, the demand curve labeled D private, represents the marginal private benefit, or MPB, the benefit that the consumer receives directly from consuming the good. It shows how much the consumers are willing to pay for each additional unit of the good. The supply curve S represents the marginal private cost and also the marginal social cost, the cost to the producer of producing the good, and in this case, we are assuming there are no external costs to production, so the private cost equals the social cost. However, because there are spillover benefits, the marginal social benefit, the MSB curve, labeled D social here, lies above the private demand curve. The MSB represents the total benefit to society, including both the private benefit to the consumer and the external benefit to others. The market equilibrium occurs at the intersection of private supply and private demand. This is where the private cost to the producers equals the private benefit to the consumers. This is the outcome we would expect if the market was left to its own devices. But the socially optimal level of consumption occurs at the intersection of MSB and MSC. This is where the total cost to society equals to the total benefit to the society. This is the outcome that would maximize overall social welfare. As you can see, the market underprovides goods with positive externalities. The quantity consumed in the market is less than the socially optimal quantity. This difference between Q market and Q social represents the inefficiency caused by the positive externality. The shaded gray triangle is the deadweight loss. And now let's discuss some of the reasons why this might happen. First is lost transactions. Between Q market and Q social, there are units of the good that could be produced and consumed where the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal social cost. This means that producing and consuming these units would create more benefit for society than they cost. The next reason is unrealized gains. These are potential transactions that would make someone better off without making anyone else worse off. They are mutually beneficial trades that are not happening because the market is only reflecting private benefits, not the full social benefits. And another reason could be inefficient allocation, Resources are not being allocated in a way that maximize social welfare. Too few resources are being devoted to the production and consumption of this good because the market is not capturing the positive spillover effects. Essentially, the deadweight loss represents the total value of these lost opportunities for a mutually beneficial exchange. It's a measure of the economic inefficiency resulting from the positive externality. But why does this happen? Because consumers only consider their private benefits and costs when making consumption decisions. They don't take into account the external benefits to others. So in the case of positive externalities in consumption, the free market doesn't produce enough of the good from society's perspective. There are potential benefits to society that are being left on the table. So we've established that positive externalities in consumption lead to underprovision of the good in the free market. But how can the government correct this market failure? One common way is through consumer subsidies. A subsidy is essentially a payment from the government to either buyers or sellers of a good. In this case, we are focusing on consumer subsidies, which are payments to buyers. Think about subsidies for electric vehicles. The government might offer a tax credit or a rebate to people who purchased an EV. This is a subsidy designed to encourage the consumption of electric vehicles, which have positive externalities like reduced air pollution. Or consider subsidies for higher education. Government grants or scholarships reduce the cost of college, encouraging people to pursue higher education, which, as we discussed earlier, generates positive externalities for the society. In this graph, the initial market equilibrium, without any intervention, is at the intersection of supply and private demand, resulting in a market price of P market and a market quantity of Q market. Okay. Now, when the government introduces a subsidy, it effectively reduces the cost of the good for consumers. This leads to an increase in demand represented by the shift of the demand curve from D private to D subsidy. Okay. The vertical distance between these two demand curves represents the amount of the subsidy per unit. The new equilibrium occurs at the intersection of the supply curve and the demand curve with the subsidy. Okay. Notice what happens here. The quantity consumed increases from Q market to Q social, moving closer to the socially optimal level of consumption. The price that firms receive, P firm, is higher than the initial market price. Okay. The price that consumers pay, P consumer, is lower than the initial market price. The difference between P firm and P consumer is the amount of the subsidy. Okay, so consumer subsidies encourage the consumption of goods with positive externalities, leading to a quantity that is closer to the socially optimal level. Okay, all right, so we've looked at positive externalities on the consumption side. Now let's examine positive externalities on the production side. These occur when the production of a good or service generates benefits for third parties, for people other than the producer. Think about research and development, R&D. Okay, when a company invests in R&D, it might discover new technologies or knowledge that not only benefit the company itself, but also spill over to other firms and industries. This can lead to broader economic growth and innovation. In this graph, the demand curve D represents the marginal private benefit and also the marginal social benefit. In this case, we are assuming there are no external benefits to consumption. So the private benefit equals to the social benefit. But the supply curve labeled S private represents the marginal private cost, okay, the cost that producer incurs directly from producing the good. However, because there are also these spillover benefits, okay, the marginal social cost curve labeled S social here, okay, lies below the private supply curve. The MSC represents the total cost to the society of producing the good, including both the private cost to the producer and the external benefits to the others. Okay, the vertical distance between the two supply curves at any given quantity represents the magnitude of these spillover benefits. The market equilibrium occurs at the intersection of the private supply and demand. Okay, this is where the private cost to producers equals the private benefit to the consumers. Okay, this is the outcome we would expect if the market was left to its own devices, right? Okay, but the socially optimal level of production occurs at the intersection of MSC and MSB. Okay, this is where the total cost to society equals to the total benefit to the society. This is the outcome that would maximize overall social welfare. As you can see, the market underprovides the goods with positive externalities in production. The quantity produced in the market, Q market, is less than the socially optimal quantity, which is Q social, right? Okay, this difference between Q market and Q social represents the inefficiency caused by the positive externality. The shaded gray triangle, again, is the deadweight loss, representing the potential gains from trade that are not realized in the market. But again, why does this happen? Because producers only consider their private costs and benefits when making production decisions. They don't fully take into account the external benefits to others. Okay, so in the case of positive externalities in production, the free market doesn't produce enough of the good from the society's perspective. There are potential benefits to the society that are being left on the table. So we've seen how subsidies to consumers can address positive externalities in consumption. Now let's look at how producer subsidies can be used to correct the positive externalities in production. Remember our example of R&D. The government often provides subsidies to firms engaged in R&D, such as tax credits or direct grants. Okay, this is because R&D generates these spillover benefits to the broader economy. Or consider renewable energy. Governments often subsidize the production of solar panels, wind turbines, and other renewable energy technologies. This is to encourage their production and use, as they have positive externalities like reducing reliance on fossil fuels and mitigating climate change. In this graph, the initial market equilibrium without any intervention is at the intersection of private supply and private demand. Okay? When the government introduces a subsidy to producers, it effectively reduces their cost of production. This leads to an increase in supply, represented by the shift of the supply curve from S to S subsidy. Okay? The vertical distance between these two supply curves represents the amount of subsidy per unit. The new equilibrium occurs at the intersection of the supply curve with the subsidy and private demand. Notice what happens here. The quantity produced increases from Q market to Q social, moving closer to the socially optimal level of production, right? The price that firms receive, P firm, is higher than the initial market price. The price that consumers pay is lower than the initial market price. The difference between the two is the amount of the subsidy. Okay? So producer subsidies encourage the production of goods with positive externalities, leading to a quantity that is closer to the socially optimal level. Okay? They essentially internalize the external benefits, bringing the market outcome closer to the efficient outcome. Alright, so we've explored positive externalities and how they lead to under-provision of goods. Now let's talk about the opposite side, negative externalities. Negative externalities occur when the consumption of a good or service imposes costs on third parties on people other than the buyer. Think about smoking. When someone smokes, they're not only harming their own health, which is the private cost, but they're also exposing others to second-hand smoke, which is an external cost. Okay? Or consider loud music in an apartment building. The person listening to the music really enjoys it, which is the private benefit. But their neighbors suffer from the noise, which is an external cost. In this graph, the demand curve labeled D private represents the marginal private benefit, the benefit that the consumer directly receives from consuming the good. The supply curve S represents the marginal private cost and also the marginal social cost, assuming there are no external costs on the production side. Okay. However, because there are spillover costs, the marginal social benefit curve, labeled D social here, okay, lies below the private demand curve now. Okay. The vertical distance between these curves represents the magnitude of these spillover costs. The market equilibrium occurs where the private supply and demand intersect. But the socially optimal level occurs where MSB and MSC intersect. Okay. Notice that the market overprovides goods with negative externalities. The market quantity, Q market, is greater than the socially optimal quantity, Q social. Okay. The shaded gray triangle, again, is the deadweight loss, representing the net loss to the society from this excessive consumption. Okay. This happens because consumers only consider their private benefits and costs, not the external costs they impose on others. Okay. So in the case of negative externalities in consumption, the free market results in too much of the good being consumed from the society's perspective, leading to an inefficient outcome. So we've seen that negative externalities in consumption lead to over-provision of the good in the free market. How can the government correct this? One common way is through consumer taxes. A tax is a payment to the government. In this case, we are focusing on taxes on consumers, which increases the cost of the good for the buyers. Think about taxes on cigarettes. Governments impose excise taxes on cigarettes to discourage smoking, which generates negative externalities due to second-hand smoke. Or consider carbon taxes on gasoline. These taxes increase the cost of driving, aiming to reduce consumption and the associated negative externalities like air pollution. In this graph, the initial market equilibrium is at the intersection of the supply curve and the private demand curve. Okay? A tax on consumers shifts the demand curve from D private to D social, okay, with the vertical distance representing the tax per unit. The new equilibrium is where the supply curve intersects the social demand curve. Okay? Notice that the quantity consumed decreases from Q market to Q social, moving closer to the socially optimal level. The price consumers pay increases and the price producers receive decreases, with the difference being the tax. Okay? So consumer taxes discourage consumption of goods with negative externalities, and this leads to a more efficient outcome. Alright, we've discussed negative externalities in consumption. Now let's explore negative externalities on the production side. These occur when the production of a good or service imposes costs on third parties, on people other than the producer. Think about a factory that emits air pollution. The factory incurs private costs like labor and materials, but the pollution also imposes external costs on the surrounding community in the form of health problems and environmental damage. Or consider industrial waste dumped into a river. The company saves money by not properly disposing of the waste, which is a private benefit, but this creates external costs for downstream communities in terms of contaminated water and harm to ecosystems. In this graph, the demand curve D represents the marginal private benefit and also the marginal social benefit, assuming there are no external costs of consumption. Okay, the supply curve labeled S market represents the marginal private cost, the cost that producers incur directly from producing the good. Okay, however, because there are these spillover costs, the marginal social cost curve labeled S social here, okay, lies above the private supply curve. The vertical distance between these curves represents the magnitude of these spillover costs. Okay, the market equilibrium is at the intersection of private supply and private demand. The socially optimal level is at the intersection of MSC and MSB. Okay, notice that the market overprovides the goods with negative externalities of production. The market quantity is greater than the socially optimal quantity. The shaded gray triangle is again the deadweight loss, representing the net loss to society from this excessive production. This happens because producers only consider their private costs and benefits and not the external costs they impose on others. Okay, so in the case of negative externalities in production, the free market results in too much of the good being produced from the society's perspective, leading to an inefficient outcome. Alright, we've seen how negative externalities in production lead to over-provision of the good in the free market. But how can the government correct this? One way is through producer taxes, right? A tax on producers increases the cost of production, aiming to reduce output and internalize the external costs. Okay, think about a carbon tax on a factory's emissions. This tax increases the factory's operating costs, making it more expensive to produce goods and encouraging them to reduce their pollution. Okay, or consider taxes on the extraction of natural resources like coal. These taxes increase the cost of extraction, aiming to reduce the amount extracted and mitigate the environmental damage associated with it. Okay, in this graph, the initial market equilibrium is at the intersection of private supply and demand, resulting in P market and Q market. Okay, but a tax on producers shifts the supply curve from S private to S social, with the vertical distance representing the tax per unit. Okay, the new equilibrium is where the social supply curve intersects the demand curve. Okay, notice that the quantity produced decreases from Q market to Q social, moving closer to the socially optimal level. Okay, the price consumers pay increases and the price producers effectively receive decreases, with the difference being the tax. So producer taxes discourage production of goods with negative externalities, okay, leading to a more efficient outcome. Alright, so we've been discussing market failures for a while now and also how government can intervene to improve efficiency. Now let's touch on another important aspect of government intervention, that is to address income inequality. Okay, income inequality refers to the unequal distribution of income among the individuals or households in an economy. Okay, there are various reasons why income inequality exists, right? Some people have more skills or education, some maybe inherit wealth, or some are in high demand professions, and there can also be factors like discrimination or unequal access to opportunities, right? We can measure income inequality in various ways, right? But one of the most common and visually appealing tools is the Lorenz curve, which you see here. Okay, the x-axis represents the cumulative percentage of families or households from the poorest to the richest. Okay, the y-axis represents the cumulative percentage of total income earned by these families. Okay, the dotted green line here represents the line of perfect equality. Okay, if income were distributed perfectly equally, 10% of families would earn 10% of the income, 50% of the families would earn 50% of the income, and so on. Okay, this line shows the ideal scenario. Okay, but the curved red line is the Lorenz curve itself. Okay, it shows the actual distribution of income in a given economy. Let's look at a couple of points on the Lorenz curve in this example. Okay, the 0.50%, 25%, okay, tells us that the bottom 50% of the families earn only 25% of the total income. Okay, the 0.50%, 50%, okay, so this point is shown just for comparison with the perfect equality line, okay, highlighting the deviation from equal distribution. This slide provides a visual demonstration of how the Lorenz curve reflects different levels of income inequality. Okay, let's look at them one by one. In the graph on the left, the Lorenz curve is relatively close to the line of perfect equality. This indicates a relatively equal distribution of income. Okay, the 0.50%, 50% shows that the bottom 50% of families earn almost 50% of the total income, right? There might still be some inequality as the curve isn't perfectly aligned with the line of equality, but it's not very pronounced. In the middle graph, the Lorenz curve bows out more significantly. This indicates a greater degree of income inequality, right? Okay, the 0.50%, 25% shows that the bottom 50% of families earn only 25% of the total income. Okay, the gap between the actual income distribution and the perfectly equal distribution is larger now. Okay, in the graph on the right, the Lorenz curve bows out dramatically. This indicates a high level of income inequality. The 0.50%, 10% shows that the bottom 50% of the families earn a mere 10% of the total income. Okay, the distance between the Lorenz curve and the line of perfect equality is substantial. As you can see, as the Lorenz curve moves further away from the line of perfect equality, it signifies an increase in income inequality. The greater the area between the curve and the line of equality, the more unequal the income distribution in a society. We've seen how the Lorenz curve provides a visual representation of income inequality, but we can also quantify this inequality using a measure called the Gini coefficient. This slide shows the same Lorenz curve we've been working with for a while now, but now we've labeled two areas on the graph. Okay, area A is the area between the line of perfect equality and the actual Lorenz curve. Okay, it represents the degree of inequality in the income distribution. Area B is the area below the Lorenz curve. Okay, the Gini coefficient is calculated using the formula shown here. Okay, it's A over A plus B. Okay, in other words, it's the ratio of the area between the line of perfect equality and the Lorenz curve, which is area A, to the total area below the line of perfect equality. Okay, area A and area B together. Let's think about what this formula tells us. If income were distributed perfectly equally, the Lorenz curve would coincide with the line of perfect equality. Okay, in that case, area A would be 0 and the Gini coefficient would also be 0. Okay, a Gini coefficient of 0 represents perfect equality. But if all income were concentrated in the hands of, let's say, one family, the Lorenz curve would be a flat line along the x-axis and then a vertical line at 100% of the families. Okay, because this is one family with all the wealth. In this extreme case, area B would be 0 and the Gini coefficient would be equal to 1. Okay, Gini coefficient of 1 represents perfect inequality. Okay, therefore the Gini coefficient ranges from 0 to 1, where a value closer to 0 indicates a more equal income distribution and a value closer to 1 indicates a more unequal income distribution. Okay, the Gini coefficient provides a single number which is like a summary of the information contained in the Lorenz curve, making it easier to compare income inequality across different countries or different time periods. Alright, so we've established that income inequality exists and we have tools like the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient to measure it. Okay, but the question then arises, can income be redistributed? And if so, how? One of the primary ways governments attempt to redistribute income is through the tax system. Okay, let's explore three main types of tax structures as shown by these graphs. Okay, first is progressive tax. In a progressive tax system, the tax rate increases as your income increases. As you can see on the left graph here, the bars get taller as we move from left to right, right? Indicating a higher tax rate for higher earners. Okay, the federal income tax is a prime example of a progressive tax. Higher earners pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes than the lower earners. Okay, then we look at proportional tax. In a proportional tax system, the tax rate remains constant regardless of income levels. Okay, the middle graph here shows bars of equal height signifying this constant rate. Okay, a flat tax where everyone pays the same percentage is an example of a proportional tax, although this might be quite rare in practice. Okay, then we look at regressive tax. In this system, the tax rate decreases as income increases. This might seem counterintuitive, but it often happens indirectly. Okay, sales taxes can be regressive because lower income individuals tend to spend a larger proportion of their income on consumption and therefore pay a larger proportion of their income in sales taxes compared to higher income individuals who save more. It's important to understand these different tax structures because they have significant implications for income distribution and the overall fairness of the tax system. Well, that brings us to the end of this session and more importantly, the end of our microeconomics journey together. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you for your time and your attention and your engagement throughout this course. I truly hope that this has helped you gain a deeper understanding of the fascinating world of microeconomics. If you found this content helpful, please do me a huge favor and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Okay, it's the best way to stay updated on new videos, and more importantly, it really helps to support the creation of more educational content like this. And please don't hesitate to share these videos with your classmates, friends, or anyone else who might benefit from them. Okay, and if you're looking for additional resources or if you'd like to take your learning to the next level, I encourage you to visit my website at jofessor.com. Okay, there you can find information on how to book an online tutoring session if you need personalized help, and you can also check out any digital products there that might be of interest to you. And finally, if you're any professors or teachers who are watching this, if you're interested in accessing the digital material used in any of my videos, such as the slides or any other resources, please feel free to reach out to me through the website. I'm happy to explore how these materials might be helpful in your own teaching. Your continued support is what makes it possible for me to create and share this educational content. So thank you again for being such an awesome audience. Take care. Cheers.